If you have a hooded eyelid, meaning a small fold of skin partially covers part of your lash line when your eyes are open, you already know exactly the frustration I am about to describe. You carefully apply your eyeliner. It looks perfectly fine while you are leaning close to the mirror, and then the moment you sit back or your eyes open fully, half of that line has simply disappeared under the fold, or it looks crooked, or it has transferred onto the skin above it by lunchtime. This is not a skill problem. It is a technique problem. And today I am walking you through the exact step-by-step method that solves it completely, built specifically for a hooded eye shape after 60, when this particular fold tends to become slightly more pronounced. I want to be honest with you about something before we begin. Almost every eyeliner tutorial you have ever watched was filmed on a completely different eye shape than the one many of us actually have. That mismatch is the entire reason hooded eyes get such an unfair reputation for being difficult to line well. There is nothing difficult about your eye shape. There is only a technique built for the wrong shape being applied to yours. Follow these steps in order, and by the end of this video, you will have a clear, repeatable routine that actually works with your eye rather than against it. Welcome back to Stylish 60 Plus, the channel where we talk honestly about what actually works for our faces at this stage of life. Let's begin with step 1. Step 1, prep the lid properly before you touch a single liner product. This step gets skipped constantly, and skipping it is responsible for more smudging, transferring, and fading than almost any other single factor. Hooded eyelids have a very specific challenge that flatter lids simply do not deal with in the same way. The fold of skin sitting just above your lash line makes frequent close contact with your upper lash line itself throughout the day, every time you blink. On bare skin or skin with only a moisturizer underneath, this repeated contact transfers a small amount of product from your lash line up onto the fold with every single blink, which is exactly why liner on a hooded eye tends to look smudged by midday, even when it looked crisp that morning. The fix is a very thin layer of eye primer, or if you do not own a dedicated primer, a small amount of translucent setting powder pressed gently across the entire lid, including the area under the fold itself. This creates a slightly drier, less slippery surface for your liner to grip onto, and it gives the fold something less prone to picking up and smearing product every time it makes contact with your lash line throughout the day. Apply this with a small, flat brush or a clean fingertip, patting rather than rubbing, and allow it 30 seconds or so to fully set before moving to the next step. Step 2, find your true lash line, and this is genuinely the single most important step in this entire tutorial, the one that solves the disappearing line problem almost every hooded eye woman has experienced. Here is the core issue. When your eye is open and looking straight ahead in a mirror, the fold naturally covers a portion of your actual lash line, the very spot where liner needs to sit to look correct once your eye returns to its natural resting position. If you draw your line only on the visible skin above that fold, in what feels like the natural spot to draw while looking straight into the mirror, you are drawing on the fold itself rather than on the lash line underneath it. And the moment your eye blinks or relaxes, that line shifts position entirely, disappearing, smearing, or looking disconnected from your actual lashes. Here is exactly how to find your true lash line every single time. Using 1 or 2 fingers, gently place them at the outer corner of your eye and lift the fold upward and very slightly outward, just enough that you can clearly see the full length of your lash line all the way to the inner corner. Hold this gentle lift steady with one hand while you work. This single motion exposes the actual surface you need to be drawing on, the surface that will still be visible and correctly placed once your eye relaxes back down, rather than the folded skin that only exists in this specific stretch position. It is worth spending a moment here understanding exactly why this particular fold develops and tends to become slightly more noticeable over the years. Because understanding the mechanics makes the technique itself feel far more intuitive rather than like an arbitrary set of instructions to memorize. As skin naturally loses a small amount of elasticity and collagen over time, the area of skin just beneath the eyebrow can begin to sit very slightly lower than it once did, creating a small amount of additional skin that settles down over part of the eyelid when the eyes are open in a relaxed state. This is an entirely normal, extremely common part of the aging process and has nothing whatsoever to do with how healthy, rested, or well cared for your skin actually is. It simply changes where your visible lash line sits relative to where it appears to sit at first glance, which is precisely the gap This entire tutorial is built to close. I also want to reassure you about something before we move further into the steps. If you have tried lining your eyes before and felt genuinely discouraged by the result, please understand that the frustration you experienced was never a reflection of your ability. It was the predictable result of a technique built for a different eye shape being applied to yours. Every single step in this tutorial exists specifically because the standard approach does not account for the fold we just discussed. And once you adjust for it directly, the entire process becomes considerably more straightforward than it has probably felt up until now. Step 3. Apply your liner using the dot and connect method, while continuing to hold that gentle lift from step 2 with your other hand. Trying to draw one long, continuous line while simultaneously holding a lift with your other hand is considerably harder than it needs to be, and it is exactly the kind of two-handed coordination that tends to produce a shaky, uneven result. The dot and connect method solves this beautifully. Instead of one sweeping motion, place a series of small, closely spaced dots directly along the true lash line you can now clearly see, working from the inner corner outward toward the outer corner, using short, controlled, single taps of the pencil rather than a dragging motion. Each individual dot requires only a tiny, easily managed movement, which is considerably easier to control accurately, while your other hand is occupied holding the lift steady. Once you have placed dots along the entire visible lash line, go back and connect them together with small, gentle strokes, filling in the tiny gaps between each dot. Here is why this particular combination, the lift plus the dot and connect method, works so much better together than either one used alone. The lift ensures you are drawing in the correct location, the true lash line rather than the fold. The dot and connect method ensures you can actually execute that drawing accurately while managing the slightly more complex hand position the lift requires. Used together, they solve both halves of the hooded eye eyeliner problem at once, placement and execution, rather than addressing only one of them. Step 4. Build the tapered thickness as you connect your dots. As you fill in the gaps between your dots, do not apply the same thickness the entire way across. Keep the line thin at the inner corner and allow it to build gradually thicker as it approaches the outer corner, finishing with a small, subtle upward point at the very end rather than stopping abruptly straight across. This tapered approach matters even more on a hooded eye than it does on other eye shapes, because the outer corner is typically where the hooding is most pronounced, where the fold sits most heavily. A thicker, more defined line specifically at that outer corner does real structural work, helping to visually lift and define an area that the natural fold tends to visually compress and flatten. A thin, delicate line at the inner corner, by contrast, keeps that part of the eye looking open and bright, rather than adding any unnecessary weight where the eye already tends to look naturally more open. Once you have completed the tapered line while holding the lift, gently and slowly release your fingers, allowing your eyelid to return to its natural resting position at its own pace rather than snapping back quickly. Look at your eye in the mirror now, in this natural resting state, before doing anything further. This is the moment where you will actually see whether the line you just drew on the true lash line remains visible and correctly placed now that the fold has returned to covering part of it, which is exactly the check we will walk through in detail in the next step. A brief practical note on posture while completing steps 3 and 4 together. Since holding a lift with one hand, while drawing with the other genuinely does require a bit of physical coordination that improves quickly with just a little practice. Rest the elbow of your lining hand on a flat surface, whether that is a vanity counter or the edge of a sink, rather than holding your whole arm freely in the air. This gives your drawing hand a stable, fixed pivot point, which makes small, controlled dots considerably easier to place accurately, even while your other hand is occupied holding the lift. Most women find this two-handed technique feels a little unfamiliar for the first attempt or two, and then becomes almost automatic within just a few mornings of regular practice. Step 5. Perform the relax check, and this step is what separates a routine that actually works day after day from one that only seems to work while you are still leaning close to the mirror. With your eye now fully relaxed and your fingers completely released from the lift, look at your eye at a slightly greater distance than you use during application, roughly the distance you would naturally view someone across a table. Check specifically whether your tapered line, particularly at the outer corner, remains visible and connected to your actual lashes, or whether any portion of it has disappeared beneath the fold now that it has settled back into place. If a small section near the outer corner has vanished under the fold, this tells you something valuable and specific. Not that your hand slipped, but that the fold in that particular spot sits slightly lower or heavier than it did in the lifted position, and you simply need to extend your line very slightly higher in that one small area to compensate. Using the same dot and connect approach, add 2 or 3 additional small dots just above where the line currently ends, blending them gently into the existing line. Then check again in the relaxed position until the entire line reads as continuous and visible. I want to mention a client named Barbara here, because this exact step was the missing piece for her after years of frustration. She had learned to lift and line beautifully, but she always finished the moment the line looked good in the lifted position, never checking again once she released her fingers. The very first time we added this relaxed check as its own separate step, she caught a small gap at her outer corner she had genuinely never noticed before, despite having drawn what felt like a perfect line in the mirror. Fixing that one small gap made the entire difference between a line that looked good only in theory and one that actually looked good on her real, resting eye. Step 6. Soften the top edge of your line. Once your line reads correctly in the relaxed position, take a small, tapered smudge brush and very gently push just the top edge of the line upward and outward in short, feathery motions, blending it slightly rather than leaving one hard, crisp stopping point. This is particularly valuable on a hooded eye specifically, because a completely hard-edged line sitting directly beneath the fold can look slightly stark or heavy against the natural softness of that area, while a gently diffused top edge blends more forgivingly into the fold itself, creating a softer, more youthful overall impression rather than a harsh, drawn-on appearance. Be careful to keep this softening confined to only the very top edge of the line, using a light touch rather than dragging the brush broadly across the whole lid, which would simply smear rather than gently diffuse. A small tapered brush, barely touched to the product, moved in short upward flicks, gives you exactly the right amount of softness without undoing the definition and structure you just spent the last several steps carefully building. I want to address a common worry that comes up at this exact point in the routine: the fear of undoing all the careful work from the previous steps with one clumsy pass of a smudge brush. This fear is understandable, but almost always unfounded once you understand the right amount of pressure to use. Think of the brush as barely touching the surface of the line, more of a gentle graze than any real pressure, similar to how you might dust a light layer of flour off a countertop rather than scrubbing it away. If you find your smudges consistently look heavier or messier than intended, the most common cause is simply too much product loaded onto the brush to begin with. Tap any excess off onto a tissue before the brush ever touches your eyelid, leaving only the faintest residue to do the softening work. It is also worth mentioning that this softening step is entirely optional depending on the occasion. For daytime wear, a softly diffused edge tends to look the most natural and forgiving. For an evening out, many women prefer to skip this step entirely and leave the tapered line with its original crisp edge intact, since a slightly more defined line can read as a touch more polished and dramatic under evening lighting. There is no single correct choice here, only the choice that matches how you want to feel for that particular day. Step 7, decide what to do with your lower lash line. And on a hooded eye, this decision matters more than it does on other eye shapes. Because the upper lid already carries a fold that visually adds a small amount of weight and coverage to the eye. A heavy or dark lower lash line tends to close the eye in from below as well, compounding the effect rather than balancing it, and making the eye look considerably smaller than the beautiful, carefully lined upper lid deserves to look. For most hooded eyes, the best choice is to skip the lower lash line entirely, allowing the tapered upper line to do all of the defining work on its own. If you feel your eye needs a small amount of grounding underneath, use only a very soft, smudged taupe or warm brown pencil, applied exclusively along the outer third of the lower lash line, stopping well before the midpoint of the eye and never in black. This small amount of soft color at the outer corner only can help visually connect the upper and lower lash lines at that single point, without adding weight anywhere else along the bottom of the eye. Step 8. Set your line to prevent transfer throughout the day. a step that matters especially for hooded eyes given how frequently the fold makes contact with the lash line during a normal day of blinking. Once your entire eyeliner look is complete and you are satisfied with how it looks in the relaxed check, take a small, clean, fluffy brush and press, rather than sweep, a tiny amount of the same translucent setting powder we used back in step 1 directly over the top of your finished liner line. This final light dusting does something specific and valuable. It sets the liner product itself, giving it a slightly matte, less slippery finish that resists transferring onto the fold above it throughout the day considerably better than an unset line does. This single step is often the difference between a hooded eyeliner look that holds beautifully from morning until evening and one that begins smudging upward within just a few hours, even when every previous step was executed carefully and correctly. I want to share something a client named Diane told me once we added this final setting step to her routine. She had done everything correctly up through step 6 for months, achieving a beautiful line each morning, only to watch it slowly migrate and blur by early afternoon, which she had simply accepted as an unavoidable trait of her particular eye shape. The moment she started pressing a small amount of setting powder over her finished line, that migration essentially stopped, and she told me it was the first time in years her eyeliner looked the same at the end of the day as it had that morning. A small additional detail worth knowing about this powder step, since choosing the wrong tool for it can slightly undo the benefit. Use a small, soft, tightly packed brush rather than a large, fluffy face brush, since a smaller brush lets you target only the immediate area around your finished line without accidentally dusting powder across your entire eyeshadow look and slightly dulling any shimmer or color you have already applied elsewhere. A dedicated small eye setting brush, often sold specifically for this purpose, tends to give the most precise, controlled result. For anyone who finds their liner still transfers slightly even after this step, particularly on especially warm or humid days, consider switching your base liner product itself to a gel or waterproof formula rather than a standard soft pencil. Reserving the softer pencil specifically for the dot and connect and tapering steps where its forgiving texture matters most, then setting that softer product with powder as described. This combination gives you the ease of application a soft pencil provides while still benefiting from the extended wear a more resistant formula offers underneath the finished set line. Step 9, the final full face check, and this is the step that ties every previous step together into one complete, reliable routine. Step back from your mirror entirely, ideally to a distance similar to where you would normally stand while getting dressed, rather than the close, leaning distance used throughout the earlier steps. Close your eyes fully for a moment. Let your entire face relax completely. Forehead, brow, everything. Then open your eyes naturally, the way you would look at someone standing across a room rather than the concentrated, close-up expression used during application. Look at your whole face in this state, not just your eye up close. Does the line still read clearly as intentional and lifted from this more natural distance? Does it look balanced and even between both eyes? Does the softened top edge still look gentle rather than smudged? This final check, done at a realistic distance with a fully relaxed face, is genuinely the only way to know whether the 8 steps we just walked through actually produced the result you were aiming for, since every earlier check happened either in a lifted position or very close to the mirror, neither of which reflects how your eye actually looks to the rest of the world for the remainder of your day. Let's walk through the complete routine one final time quickly, so you have the entire sequence clearly in mind. Prep your lid with a thin layer of primer or powder. Find your true lash line by gently lifting the hooded fold at the outer corner. Apply your liner using the dot and connect method while holding that lift. Build a tapered thickness, thin at the inner corner and fuller at the outer corner. Release the lift slowly and perform your relaxed check, extending the line slightly if any section has disappeared beneath the fold. Soften the top edge with a small smudge brush. Decide on your lower lash line, likely bare or only a soft touch of color at the outer third. Set the entire look with a light press of translucent powder. And finally, step back and perform one complete relaxed check of your whole face before considering your routine finished. 9 steps sounds like a great deal the first time you hear them listed together, but I promise you, once this becomes familiar, the entire routine takes only a minute or 2 longer than whatever you were doing before. And unlike your previous approach, it actually produces a line that reads correctly, and looks intentional for your entire day rather than only for the first hour after application. I think of every woman who has ever told me she simply cannot wear eyeliner because of her hooded eyes, a phrase I have heard more times than I could count over the years in this chair. It was never true. It was only ever a technique built for a different eye shape being applied to an eye that needed its own specific approach. And now you have that approach, laid out clearly, step by step, ready to use starting tomorrow morning. I want to close with one final piece of encouragement, because I know 9 steps can feel like a lot to hold in your mind all at once, especially the first time you try this complete routine. Give yourself permission to be a little slow and deliberate the first few mornings you practice this, treating it almost like learning any new skill rather than expecting instant perfection on the very first attempt. Muscle memory builds quickly with a routine this specific, and most women find that within a week of consistent practice. The entire 9 step sequence has folded naturally into something that barely feels like a list of steps at all anymore. Simply the way they now apply their eyeliner. The same way any well practiced habit eventually stops feeling like a series of separate decisions and starts feeling like one smooth, familiar motion. So tell me, which of these 9 steps do you think was the missing piece in your own routine? And are you ready to try the complete sequence tomorrow? I read every single comment, and I would genuinely love to hear how it goes for you.